My name is Colin Stokes, and this is my home, Tufts, Garth. It is right in the southernmost tip of the Cotswolds, at the spot where Wiltshire and Gloucestershire meet. In this ancient meadowland I breed my sheep, including the large and beautiful and now sadly rare Cotswold sheep, whose forebears have grazed these pastures since Roman times. These are looking rather silly, having just been shorn, but in their full, long and lustrous fleeces they are a delight to see. Whatever use these fields and buildings are put to after my death, at least the Cotswold sheep's head I've carved into the gable end will always speak of their original purpose. I make sure all my beasts are very tame. Most of the time I have to manage them entirely alone, and it would be quite impossible if I first had to chase and catch them. Apart from the small group of pedigree Cotswolds who will breed pure, the bulk of my sheep are being deliberately and very selectively crossbred to develop animals of varying greys, browns and black, with the finest quality long wool for hand spinners. It really is the most lovely part of the country in which to live. I like to think it is England at her rural best, but I admit to being biased. I designed my acre of garden to echo rather than compete with its surroundings, and if anyone knows a better excuse for nettles and couch grass, I'd like to hear it. What with the sheep and the poultry, the cottage and the garden don't get as much of my time as they deserve. I often wonder quite how I do keep everything ticking over, because then there is my real work. You see, I'm a stained glass artist, making commissions and teaching students here in my studio. Some of the steps can be completed comfortably in the house, like the initial designing and then the making of the cartoon or working drawing. I'm designing a panel for an exhibition. It's going to comprise a terracotta jug of various flowers on a chenille tablecloth. Because I like to work on my glass directly from the life, I only sketch in the most basic details on my initial drawings and on the cartoon. The critical feature of the cartoon is the system of lead lines. These represent the actual lead structure of the finished panel, which will hold all the pieces of glass together, and I draw them in very accurately in broad, indelible black felt pen. It is to these lines that all the pieces of coloured glass will be cut, and the margin of error is minute. The studio started life as a pair of stables, but I have done quite a job on it. The big north-facing window has a lovely rustic view, although it's almost always obliterated by a curious and ever-changing assortment of stained glass panels and parts of panels. I really believe that I couldn't work other than in attractive surroundings. Apart from anything else, as things have developed, most of my subject matter comes from my garden and the fields and hedgerows around my home. The colour in stained glass is mostly the colour of the glass itself, as it is made, but it can be altered and added to by various processes, and painted with shading, body, texture and detail, using metal oxides, which are then fired in the kiln to fuse and render them an intrinsic part of the glass itself. Once fired, these marks are utterly permanent. Cleaning, scratching, weather and pollution will have no effect on them. First, of course, all the glass must be cut out. This is the stage which my students frequently find the most difficult. Curiously enough, injuries are rare, even with the monumental piles of crushed and splintered glass produced by the grozing iron. It sounds rather like a medieval instrument of torture, but is actually an outsized pair of pliers used for snapping and nibbling the glass and generally getting one out of tight spots. The black oxide I use a good deal of is a mixture of powdered glass, lead, cadmium, cobalt, nickel and chromium. Hardly surprisingly, it is fairly costly. It is mixed with water and a tiny amount of gum arabic and applied to and lifted off each piece of glass with sable brushes, badger brushes and a whole range of unlikely instruments, including farrier's nails, bird's feathers, bone knitting needles and stenciling brushes. Each piece of glass will need to be painted and fired at least twice, and possibly up to 5 times before I am happy with it. Some pieces will also be painted with silver nitrate to produce a clear, brilliant yellow or amber, and this has to be applied to the opposite side of the glass, otherwise it will react adversely with the oxides. The firing temperatures and times are utterly critical. The top surface of the glass alone must melt to allow the oxides to flow into it, but should the whole piece melt, the result will resemble a shapeless blob of toffee and be utterly useless. As little as 2 or 3 minutes is sufficient for a perfect firing to become a disaster. Add to this the other possibilities of the kiln, like a piece of glass shattering into 100 splinters, or part or all of the painstaking painting disappearing without trace and without apparent reason, and you will understand how nerve-wracking the process can be. Naturally, if a piece of glass is going to shatter, it is likely to do so on the 3rd or 4th firing, thus wrecking many hours of painting and whole days of firing, and thereby putting the commission schedule back by several days at least. Nothing can be done to predict these sorts of catastrophes, but I have to say that the more experienced I have become, the less they seem to happen, so I must have learned something. To further complicate matters, different types and colours of glass, of which there are hundreds, will fire at slightly different temperatures, and the lower the firing point, the more likely the glass is to shrink slightly in the kiln. Bearing in mind that one is going to load a kiln with quite a variety of types and colours of glass, and bearing in mind what a minute margin of error there is, you will begin to appreciate some of the problems involved. Fortunately, some parts of the kiln become hotter than others, so appropriate allowances can be made in a careful loading plan. Once all the painting and firing is complete, the whole panel or window must be assembled on a leading block with a strip of specially extruded lead calm, as it is called, fitting snugly between and around each piece of glass. The lead must first be stretched and then cut into a few workable lengths, and the leaves of the calm opened to accept the glass, which of course varies quite a bit in thickness. Farrier's nails are used to pin the whole panel firmly in place prior to soldering. But before it can be soldered, the lead must be cleaned to a silvery brightness with steel wool, and every joint fluxed with tallow, the old-fashioned fat from which candles were made. This prepares the joints to take the solder. Once one side has been soldered, there comes the rather risky business of turning it over to start on the other side. At last the soldering is complete, although I often find I have missed one joint and have to reheat the iron. Now the last and far the messiest stage, the cementing. The whole panel is filled with a cement made of putty, soot, lamp black and linseed oil, which is worked thoroughly into every part so that it forms a perfect seal between the glass and the lead and renders the piece waterproof and windproof and holds everything absolutely snug and tight. Other processes I sometimes employ are hand engraving and acid etching of glass. By these means, the thickness of parts of the glass can be reduced, resulting in a paler colour. The acid etching is a truly nightmarish process, the fumes of the acid being treacherous, and I only ever use it out of doors on a still, dry day, and then with the utmost care and respect. I believe that given her the chance, it would eat an entire human being, not even leaving the teeth. Having laboured the problems, I must put the record straight. Stained glass work is, for me, the most absorbing, exciting and fulfilling art form imaginable. The thrill of holding a panel up to the light at last, after working on it for days, weeks, even months, is a thrill which never diminishes. It is probably also a thrill which, like the very process itself, has remained unchanged since the medieval artists held up those early windows before they were installed in our oldest churches and cathedrals.